The first thing Thomas Crane noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles over land at dusk, but the heavy kind that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. His horse slowed on its own near the cottonwood grove, ears twitching, uneasy. That was when Thomas saw the wagon, tilted, broken, abandoned where it didn't belong. On his land, nothing ever just appeared by accident. He dismounted carefully, one hand resting near his belt out of habit, though he hadn't carried trouble with him in years. The wagon's canvas was torn, flapping softly in the breeze. One wheel had snapped clean through. No horses, no tracks leading away. That made sense. It looked less like a wreck and more like something left behind in a hurry. Then he heard the creak. Not the water itself, but movement near it. Thomas followed the sound through the trees, boots sinking into damp earth, every step slow and deliberate. By the edge of the creek, half hidden by tall grass and low branches, sat a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair matted and tangled, her hands shaking as she dipped them into the water again and again, as if trying to wash something invisible away. She didn't turn when he spoke. "Miss," he said, keeping his voice low, steady. "You're on private land." For a long moment, he thought she hadn't heard him. Then she spoke, her voice thin but firm, like it had learned how to survive by being small. "I know." That was all. Thomas took another step closer and stopped. He'd lived long enough to recognize fear when he saw it. But this was different. This was exhaustion. The kind that comes after the worst has already happened. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head once. "Not anymore." Something about that answer settled cold in his chest. He followed the creek upstream because instinct told him to, because some part of him already knew there was more. It didn't take long before he found them, 3 men, lying still where the water slowed and spread wide. No struggle left to see, just the quiet finality of it. Thomas stood there for a long time, hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't count the seconds. He counted the years he'd spent believing the world made sense if you followed the rules. When he returned to the creek, the girl had finally looked up. Her eyes were clear. Too clear. "You found them," she said. "Yes. I did it." She didn't wait for him to ask. Didn't try to explain or justify herself. Just stated it like a fact that couldn't be undone. "They weren't going to let me go," she continued. "Not ever." Thomas felt the weight of the land pressing in around them. The law would say one thing. His badgeless conscience said another. He studied her face, searching for lies, but found none. Only a kind of calm that comes when someone has already crossed the worst line they'll ever face. "One of them was my father," she added quietly, like it was something she'd practiced saying without breaking. The creek kept moving. The trees whispered overhead. Life went on, careless and indifferent. Thomas swallowed hard. He'd seen hard men break over far less. He'd buried friends who never got a second chance. And here was this girl, standing in the aftermath of something that would follow her forever, asking for nothing. "Do you have a name?" he asked. "Ellie." He nodded once. "I'm Thomas Crane. I own this land." She finally stood, unsteady but determined. For the first time, there was something like fear in her eyes, not of what she'd done, but of what came next. "I won't run," she said. "I'm tired of running." Thomas looked back toward the wagon, then toward the distant line of his ranch buildings barely visible beyond the trees. He knew the moment would define him, whether he wanted it to or not. The law would come. Questions would be asked. Lines would be drawn. And whatever choice he made now, there would be no walking it back. "Come with me," he said at last. "You shouldn't be here when someone else finds them." Ellie hesitated only a second before nodding. As they walked away from the creek, the silence followed, but it no longer felt empty. It felt heavy with consequence. Thomas Crane did not ask Ellie to speak right away. He showed her the barn first, gave her dry clothes that had belonged to his late wife's niece, and set a kettle on the stove in the small house nearby. He understood silence. Sometimes it was the only way people could stay standing. She sat at the rough wooden table, hands wrapped around a tin cup, eyes fixed on the steam rising from it. The warmth seemed to confuse her at first, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel it. Thomas took the chair across from her, but did not crowd the space between them. He had learned long ago that trust did not come from pressure. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "They moved us a lot," Ellie said. "Never stayed long. Always said it was safer that way." Thomas nodded once. He did not interrupt. "They told me it was family," she continued. "That I owed them. That the world outside was worse." She paused, then took a slow breath. It wasn't. The words hung in the air. Thomas felt them settle deep, stirring old memories he kept buried. He had seen harm wear many faces in his lifetime, often smiling, often polite. He waited. "They said no one would believe me," Ellie said. "Said I'd be blamed. So I stayed quiet. For a long time." Her eyes flicked up to his, measuring him, searching for doubt. Thomas kept his face still. He knew better than to question pain spoken so plainly. "What happened at the creek?" he asked gently. "That day?" She tightened her grip on the cup. They were arguing. About money. About where to go next. Her voice did not shake, but her shoulders stiffened. "I realized then they weren't watching me. Not really." Thomas said nothing. "I picked up the rifle," she said. "I knew how to use it. They taught me. Thought it was funny." She swallowed. "I didn't plan anything. I just knew if I didn't act, I wouldn't survive another year. Maybe not another month." The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Thomas felt the weight of the law pressing against the truth he was hearing. Rules were simple on paper. Life was not. "You did what you believed you had to do," he said carefully. Ellie looked at him, surprised. "You don't think I'm wrong?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "I think the world sometimes leaves people with choices it shouldn't." She stared at the table again, tears finally forming but not falling. "I don't want to be like them," she said. "I don't want this to be who I am." Thomas felt a pull in his chest, something close to guilt. He had walked away from people in need before, told himself it wasn't his fight, that the law would handle it. He had buried more than one regret that way. "You won't be," he said. "Not if someone gives you the chance to be something else." She looked up again. "Why would you do that?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and poured more hot water into the kettle. His hands moved slowly, deliberately. "Because I failed once," he said at last. "And I won't fail again." That was all he offered. It was enough. He told her she could stay for a while, that there was work to be done if she wanted it. Feeding animals, mending fences, honest work that left you tired but whole. "I can do that," she said quickly, like she was afraid the offer might disappear. "You don't owe me anything," Thomas replied, "but you'll have a roof and food and time." She nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "Thank you." That night, Thomas lay awake listening to the wind move across the plains. He knew what he was risking. People would come looking. They always did. The law did not care about reasons, only outcomes. But as he stared at the dark ceiling, one thought stayed with him. If justice meant turning a broken girl over to a world that had already failed her, then maybe justice needed someone to stand in its way. And for the first time in years, Thomas Crane felt certain about a choice he had made. Morning came softly to the ranch, carried in on pale light and the sound of wind brushing the grass. Ellie was already awake when Thomas stepped outside. She stood near the corral, uncertain, as if waiting for permission to exist in the open. Thomas noticed how she watched the horizon more than the animals, always alert, always ready. He handed her a pair of worn gloves without ceremony. "Fence line needs checking," he said. "Only if you want." "I want," she answered quickly. They worked side by side in near silence. Thomas showed her how to spot a weak post, how to tighten wire without snapping it. Ellie listened closely, hands careful but determined. The rhythm of the work seemed to settle her. By midday, there was dirt on her sleeves and a faint color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. Days followed a pattern. Feed at dawn. Repairs before the sun climbed too high. Supper just as the sky turned orange. Ellie spoke little, but she watched everything. Slowly, she began to ask questions. How long Thomas had been there. Why he never hired help. Where his family was, he answered some. Others he let pass. At night, Ellie slept in the small room off the barn. The first few nights, Thomas heard her pacing until dawn. Then one night, she slept through. When he noticed, something loosened in his chest. But calm has a way of making room for memory. One afternoon, while fixing a gate, Ellie froze. Her hand tightened on the wood, knuckles pale. A rider had appeared far off on the ridge, no more than a shape against the sky, probably just passing through. But Ellie's breath shortened. "They found me," she whispered. Thomas followed her gaze. He saw nothing that worried him, but he saw what it did to her. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No one knows you're here." She shook her head. "They always say that." The words struck him harder than he expected. That night, Thomas sat alone on the porch, long after Ellie had gone inside. The past came back uninvited. A different girl. Different time. His sister, younger than Ellie had been, standing on a station platform with a single bag. He had told himself she was strong. Told himself she'd be fine. He never saw her again. The memory settled like dust he could never quite clear. The next morning, Thomas made a choice he had been avoiding. He rode into town. He did not tell Ellie where he was going, only that he would be back by sundown. The ride felt longer than it should have. Every mile carried the weight of what he might hear, what he might learn. In town, he kept his questions careful, casual. A broken wagon, missing men, anyone asking around. There were whispers, nothing clear yet, but interest was growing. On the ride back, Thomas felt the full measure of what he had taken on. This was no longer about sheltering a stranger. This was about standing between a past that refused to stay buried and a future that hadn't yet taken shape. When he returned, Ellie was in the barn, brushing one of the horses. She looked up fast, relief flooding her face when she saw him. Then she noticed his expression. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But they will." She set the brush down slowly. "Then you should send me away." The words were calm, but her eyes were not. Thomas felt the old instinct rise, the one that told him to step back, to let distance solve the problem. It would be easier, safer. "No," he said, firmer than he expected. "Running didn't save you before?" She studied him, searching for doubt, finding none. "I don't want you hurt because of me," she said. He met her gaze. "That choice is mine." Something changed then. Not relief, not peace. Something deeper. A shared understanding that whatever came next, it would be faced together. That evening, the wind shifted. Clouds gathered low and heavy, pressing down on the land. Ellie stood at the doorway of the house, watching the sky. "Storm's coming," she said. "Yes," Thomas replied. But they both knew she wasn't talking about the weather. The sound reached the ranch before the riders did. Hooves on hard ground. Voices carried by the wind. Ellie heard it first and went still, her hand resting on the doorframe of the house. Thomas was in the yard, splitting wood, when he looked up and saw dust rising along the fence line. They were not in a hurry. That worried him more than speed. 2 men rode ahead. Behind them came the sheriff's wagon, steady and official. Thomas wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped forward into the open. He did not tell Ellie to hide. He did not tell her to run. He only glanced back once, enough to let her know he was aware of her presence, enough to tell her she was not alone. Sheriff Harding dismounted first. He was a broad man with a calm face and careful eyes. He adjusted his hat and offered a polite nod, like this was a neighborly visit. "Thomas Crane," the sheriff said. "Afternoon." "Sheriff," Thomas replied. "What brings you this far out?" Before Harding could answer, another man swung down from his horse. Elias was lean, sharp-eyed, dressed well enough to show he had money behind him. His smile was thin but practiced. "We're looking for a young girl," Elias said. His voice was smooth, almost friendly. "Had some trouble on the road. Family matter." Thomas felt the familiar pressure rise in his chest. He kept his voice even. "You should explain the trouble." Elias glanced at the sheriff, then back at Thomas. 3 men are missing. One of them was my brother. Another was my uncle. They were traveling with a girl, their daughter, niece. He paused. She doesn't belong wandering alone. Ellie stepped into view then, standing just behind Thomas's shoulder. Elias's eyes locked onto her immediately. Satisfaction flickered across his face, quick and sharp. "There she is," he said softly. "Ellie, you gave us quite a scare." Her hands curled into fists, but she did not move forward. Thomas shifted slightly, placing himself fully between her and the men. "She's under my roof," Thomas said. "That means something here." Sheriff Harding raised a hand, calm and measured. "No one's here to make trouble," he said. "But there are questions. People are asking them, and I have a duty to follow up." Thomas nodded. "Then you should hear the truth." Elias chuckled lightly. "Truth is simple." She panicked. "Things went wrong. Families deserve answers." "That's not what happened," Ellie said, her voice steady but strained. Elias turned his smile on her. "Now, Ellie, let the grown folks handle this. You've always had a habit of misunderstanding situations." The words were polite. The meaning was not. Thomas felt anger rise, hot and dangerous. He kept it contained. "She's spoken enough to me," he said. "More than enough." Sheriff Harding studied Thomas closely. "You're saying you know what happened?" "I do." "And you're willing to stand by it?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yes." A silence stretched between them. The wind moved through the grass. One of the armed men shifted his weight, hand resting near his belt. Harding noticed and cleared his throat. "Thomas," the sheriff said, lowering his voice, "if this goes the way it looks, you're asking me to ignore the law." "I'm asking you to see beyond it," Thomas replied. "Those men harmed her. Over years. She ended it. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She survived." Elias's smile vanished. "That's a serious claim." "It's the truth," Thomas said. "And if you take her from here, you won't be delivering justice. You'll be finishing what they started." Ellie's breath caught, but she stood her ground. Sheriff Harding looked from her to Thomas, then back to Elias. "Is there anyone else who can speak to this? Anyone who knew?" Elias stiffened. "Family matters stay in the family." "That's not an answer," Harding said. The tension thickened. For a moment, Thomas wondered if this would end badly despite everything. He felt the weight of his choice fully now. There was no turning away, no half measures. Finally, Harding sighed. "I'm not blind," he said. "And I'm not deaf. I've heard whispers before this visit, things that don't sit right." Elias's voice sharpened. "Sheriff, I said enough," Harding cut in. He turned back to Thomas. "I can't promise this ends today, but I won't take her by force. Not like this." Elias stared at the sheriff in disbelief. "You're just going to leave her here?" "For now," Harding said. "And you'll leave too." The air seemed to release its grip all at once. Elias mounted his horse, anger burning through his careful mask. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Thomas met his gaze. "I know." As the riders turned away and the dust settled, Ellie finally exhaled. Thomas felt the tremor in his own hands then, the cost of standing firm. The line had been drawn, and there was no mistaking it anymore. Dawn arrived slowly, as if the land itself was unsure what it would reveal. A thin line of light stretched across the plains, turning the dust in the air gold. Thomas stood on the porch, coffee untouched in his hands, watching the horizon. He had not slept. Neither had Ellie. She stepped outside quietly and stood beside him. No words passed between them. They both knew this morning mattered. Whatever came next would decide whether the ranch remained a refuge or became just another place they had to leave behind. By mid-morning, the sound of a wagon returned. This time, there was no rush in it, no edge. Sheriff Harding arrived alone. He removed his hat before speaking. That small gesture told Thomas more than words could. "I spent the night listening," Harding said. "Old reports, old rumors folks were too polite to press on." He paused, eyes drifting toward Ellie. "Turns out silence can hide a lot." Ellie stiffened, waiting. "There won't be charges," the sheriff continued. "Not against her, not against you." Thomas felt the tension ease from his shoulders, but he did not speak. Harding met his gaze. "The men who came here won't be back. Not officially, and not quietly. Sometimes the best thing the law can do is step aside." Ellie's breath caught. She looked at Thomas, unsure how to hold relief without fear. Harding turned to her then. His voice softened. "You're safe here, as long as you choose to be." She nodded once. "I do." The sheriff tipped his hat and left, the wagon rolling away until it became part of the land again. Time moved forward after that, steady and ordinary. The ranch returned to its rhythms. Ellie stayed. She learned the land not as a place to hide, but as a place to belong. Her hands grew strong. Her laughter returned in small, careful pieces. She planted a garden by the house and insisted Thomas try every failed recipe before she got one right. Seasons passed. People stopped asking questions. Years later, the ranch looked fuller. Fences stood straight. The barn doors bore fresh paint. A young woman rode the fence line with confidence, her posture easy, her eyes clear. She no longer startled at distant riders. She waved when neighbors passed. Thomas watched her from the porch, older now, slower, but lighter than he had been in decades. One evening, as the sun settled low, Ellie joined him. "You never asked me to leave," she said. He smiled faintly. "You never asked to stay." She leaned against the railing. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas thought of the silence by the creek, the broken wagon, the choice that had changed everything. He thought of all the times he had done nothing before, and how heavy those memories still felt. "No," he said. "I regret the times I didn't choose." Ellie nodded, understanding more than she would have years ago. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere, a gate creaked softly. Life, simple and earned, continued. When night came, a light burned in the house. Not because it was needed, but because it could. And if anyone asked what justice looked like on that stretch of land, it wasn't written in a book or nailed to a wall. It stood there, alive, choosing to stay.